On the day of their 5th anniversary, Vianne Brown looked his wife in the eye and handed her divorce papers with a smirk, claiming she wasn't CEO material. He saw her darned socks and frugality as signs of failure, completely blind to the reality that the woman sitting across from him was the secret sole heir to the Sinclair banking dynasty. Vianne thought he was trading up, but the moment he signed those papers, he did more than end a marriage. He declared war on the only financial lifeline he had. The waiter at Le Bernardin poured the vintage Pinot Noir with a practiced silent grace. It was a 2015 Domaine de la Romanée Conti, a bottle that cost more than Lydia's first car. Vianne Brown didn't even look at the label. He was too busy checking the reflection of his Rolex Daytona in the knife. "Happy anniversary, Vianne," Lydia said softly. She was wearing a navy blue dress she'd bought off the rack at Macy's 3 years ago. It was modest, clean, and entirely unremarkable, just like Lydia. Or at least that's what Vianne told himself every time he looked at her these days. Vianne looked up, flashing that charming, practiced smile that had graced the cover of Forbes' 30 Under 30 last month. "Happy anniversary, Lyd." He didn't reach for her hand. He reached into his suit jacket, a bespoke Tom Ford that fit him like armor, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He placed it on the crisp white tablecloth, right between the candle and the untouched bread basket. Lydia looked at the envelope, then up at his eyes. Her expression didn't change. There was no gasp, no tearing up, just a stillness that Vianne mistook for stupidity. "I got you something too," she whispered, reaching for her purse. "Wait," Vianne said, his voice dropping an octave, putting on his serious CEO face. "Open mine first. Please, it's important." Lydia hesitated, her hand hovering over her battered leather tote. Slowly she picked up the envelope. She slid a manicured finger under the flap and pulled out the document. "Petition for dissolution of marriage." The bold letters seemed to scream in the quiet restaurant. "I know this is hard." Vianne started his rehearsed speech, flowing instantly. "But look at us, Lydia. We're in different worlds now. When we met, I was coding in a garage. Now Brown Tech is about to go public. I have galas to attend investors in Silicon Valley partners in Tokyo. You like your book clubs and your gardening." He took a sip of the expensive wine, gaining confidence. "Jessica, my VP of marketing, she gets it. She understands the pressure. Honestly, Lydia, I'm doing this for you. You're drowning in my world. I want to set you free." Lydia read the first page. She didn't scream. She didn't throw the wine in his face. She simply asked, "Jessica, the blonde with the Wharton MBA who laughs too hard at your jokes." Vianne stiffened. "She's a brilliant strategist. And yes, we're together. I didn't want to lie to you anymore." Lydia nodded slowly. She placed the papers down. "You want a divorce because I don't fit your image, Vianne, because I'm plain. It's not just looks, Lydia. It's class." Vianne said, his cruelty leaking out. "You're a sweet girl from Ohio, but I need a partner who can walk into a room and command respect. I need someone with a pedigree, someone who understands power." The irony was so thick it nearly choked her. Lydia looked down at her simple hands. Hands that had signed checks to keep his startup afloat during the lean years, checks routed through shell companies so his fragile ego wouldn't bruise. "The prenup," Lydia said quietly. Vianne scoffed. "Don't worry, I'm generous. I'm letting you keep the house in Jersey, the Audi, and I'll give you a monthly stipend for 2 years. But the company, the IP, that's mine. You signed the prenuptial agreement 5 years ago, Lydia. What's mine is mine. What's yours? Well, you didn't have anything then, and you don't have anything now. He slid a Mont Blanc pen across the table. "Sign it, Lydia. Don't make a scene. Let's handle this like adults." Lydia picked up the pen. She looked at him one last time, searching for a trace of the man she had fallen in love with, the humble dreamer who just wanted to change the world. He was gone, replaced by this hollow suit who thought he was a king because he had a few million in venture capital. "Okay," she whispered. She flipped to the back page and signed her name with a steady hand. Lydia Brown. "Thank you." Vian let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He snatched the papers back, checking the signature. "You're doing the right thing." Lydia stood up. She didn't touch her food. She didn't touch her wine. "I was going to give you my gift," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "But I think you just gave me the best gift of all, Vian." "So, what was it?" he asked, distracted, already texting Jessica under the table. "I was going to tell you that my father is finally coming to town to meet you," Lydia said. "Arthur. He wanted to discuss the Series B funding personally." Vian laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Your dad. The retired mechanic, Lydia. I'm looking for $10 million, not an oil change. Give him my best, though." Lydia smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that Vian had never seen before. "Goodbye, Vian." She walked out of the restaurant. As she stepped onto the busy New York street, she pulled her phone from her purse and dialed a number she hadn't called in 5 years. "Daddy," she said into the phone. "It's done. You can cut the lines." The packing took less than 2 hours. Vian stayed at a hotel that night, the Four Seasons, naturally likely with Jessica, so Lydia had the house to herself. It was a sprawling modern mansion in the Palisades, cold and grey, filled with furniture Vian had hired a designer to pick out. It never felt like home. Lydia didn't take the jewelry Vian had bought her guilt gifts for missed birthdays. She didn't take the designer clothes he forced her to wear to galas. She packed her old jeans, her worn-out college hoodies, the locket her mother gave her before she passed, and most importantly, a small fireproof safe from the back of her closet. She opened the safe. Inside wasn't cash or diamonds. It was a stack of documents, birth certificates, trust fund deeds, and a passport bearing her real name, Lydia Sinclair. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the prenup copy Vian had left on the nightstand. He was so proud of that document. He had his lawyers draft it to ensure that if his company took off, this nobody girl couldn't take half his billions. He had insisted on a total separation of assets clause. Whatever is acquired by a party remains the sole property of that party. Neither spouse has any claim to the familial wealth or inheritance of the other. He thought he was protecting his millions. He didn't realize he had just protected her billions. Lydia was the only daughter of Arthur Sinclair. In the world of finance, names like Zuckerberg or Musk were new money. The Sinclairs were the bedrock. They owned the banks that loaned money to the billionaires. They owned shipping lines, real estate empires in London and Dubai, and hold vast reserves of gold bullion. When Lydia met Vian, she was trying to escape that suffocating weight. She wanted to be seen for her, not her checkbook. So she became Lydia Smith. She lived simply. She fell in love with a struggling coder. And when he couldn't make payroll 3 years ago, it was Lydia who called her father's private asset manager. "Buy his debt," she had told the manager. "Route it through a shell company in the Caymans, or call it Apex Ventures. Make sure he never knows it's me." For 3 years, Apex Ventures had been the silent hand feeding brown tech. Lydia zipped up her duffel bag. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Vian. "Vian, I'll send the movers for the furniture next week. Please be out by noon tomorrow." Jessica wants to measure for drapes. Lydia didn't reply. She walked out to the driveway. She didn't take the Audi. Instead, a black Lincoln Navigator with tinted windows was waiting at the curb. A man in a dark suit stepped out and opened the back door. "Good evening, Ms. Sinclair," the driver said, bowing his head slightly. "Your father is waiting at the airstrip. The jet is fueled." "Thank you, James," Lydia said, sliding into the leather interior. "Where to after the meeting with your father, Mum?" Lydia looked back at the house one last time. The house where she had tried to build a normal life. The house where she had been told she wasn't enough. "The Hamptons estate," she said, "and James, call the legal team at Harrington and Associates. Tell them I want to activate the clean slate protocol regarding Brown Tech." "Immediately, Mum." As the car pulled away, Lydia didn't cry. The plain housewife was gone. The Empress had returned. 1 week later, Vianne Brown walked into the Brown Tech headquarters like he owned the building, which technically he felt he did. The divorce was moving smoothly. Lydia had disappeared without a fight, just as he predicted. No drama, no screaming lawyers. She had just vanished. Weak, he thought. She always was weak. He walked into the conference room. Jessica was there looking stunning in a red Prada dress, sitting at the head of the table. The board members were gathered. Today was the day they were supposed to finalize the Series B funding with Apex Ventures. That $50 million injection would propel them to IPO. "Good morning, everyone," Vianne boomed, pouring himself a coffee. "Let's get this signed. I have a tea time at noon." "Vianne," said heavy-set man, the CFO, looking pale. "We have a problem." Vianne paused. "What problem did the servers crash?" "It's Apex Ventures." The CFO said, his hands shaking as he held a tablet. "They pulled out." The room went silent. "What do you mean they pulled out?" Vianne laughed nervously. "We have a term sheet. It's a formality. They didn't just pull out of the Series B, Vianne. They called in their loans." Vianne froze. "Loans? What loans?" "The bridge financing from 3 years ago, the operating capital from last year, the emergency line of credit from last month." The CFO was sweating now. "Apex Ventures holds 80% of our debt. The terms stated that the debt was callable at will by the creditor. We all signed it because we were desperate and they were friendly." "They can't call it all at once." Vianne slammed his fist on the table. "That's $20 million. We don't have that cash on hand. They gave us a deadline." Jessica interjected, her voice sharp, her eyes glued to her laptop. 24 hours, Vianne. Or they file for insolvency and seize the assets, the IP, the code, everything. "Get them on the phone," Vianne screamed. "Who is the contact? Get Smith on the phone." "I tried," Jessica said, looking up. The admiration that was usually in her eyes was replaced by fear. "The number for Apex Ventures is disconnected. All inquiries are being routed to a law firm." "Which firm?" "Harrington and Associates," the CFO whispered. Vianne felt the blood drain from his face. Harrington and Associates wasn't just a law firm. They were the pit bulls of Wall Street. They represented the royal family oil tycoons and the Sinclairs. "Why would Harrington be involved with a Cayman shell company?" Vianne muttered. "There's more," Jessica said, standing up. "We just lost the cloud server contract." "What?" Vianne spun around. "That's our biggest revenue stream. The client sent a termination notice this morning, effective immediately. They cited instability in leadership." "I am the leadership," Vianne roared. "I am the most stable CEO in this sector." "Vianne," Jessica said, her voice trembling. "The client who cancelled. It's Sinclair Maritime, the global shipping giant." Vianne stopped. The name rang a bell. "Sinclair. Your dad, the retired mechanic." He remembered Lydia's words at the restaurant. My father, Arthur, wanted to discuss the Series B funding. No, it was impossible. Lydia was Lydia Smith. Her dad fixed cars in Dayton, Ohio. He had seen photos of him in greasy coveralls. It's a coincidence, Vian said, wiping sweat from his forehead. Lots of people are named Sinclair. Okay, look, we fixed this. We need a new investor. Fast. Who? The CFO asked. Apex has flagged us as high risk. No bank will touch us. Ethan Caldwell, Vian said. The room groaned. Ethan Caldwell was a shark, a corporate raider. He bought distressed companies, stripped them for parts, and left the carcasses to rot. He was also Vian's sworn enemy from business school. He's the only one with liquid cash who moves fast enough, Vian said, buttoning his jacket. I'll go to him. I'll offer him equity, a lot of it. We just need to survive the week. Vian, if you go to Caldwell, he will eat you alive, Jessica warned. I don't have a choice, Vian snapped at her. Unless you have $20 million in your Prada bag, Jessica, shut up and let me handle this. Jessica's eyes narrowed, the first crack in the paradise. Vian stormed out of the office. He grabbed his phone and dialed Ethan Caldwell's number. It rang twice. Well, well, Ethan's smooth, mocking voice answered. Vian Brown, to what do I owe the pleasure? Finally decided to sell me that algorithm. I need a meeting, Ethan. Tonight? Vian said, trying to sound authoritative, but sounding desperate. Tonight, I'm afraid I'm busy, Ethan drawled. There is a private gala at the Metropolitan Museum, the Sinclair Foundation Charity Ball, very exclusive, but I suppose I could get you a guest pass, if you're willing to beg. Vian gritted his teeth. I'll be there. Good. Wear a tuxedo, Vian, and try not to look so bankrupt. See you at 8. Vian hung up. He hailed a cab, his mind racing. He had to charm Ethan. He had to secure the money. He didn't know that he was walking into a lion's den. And he certainly didn't expect that the lion tamer would be the woman he just divorced. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was transformed into a fortress of light and glass. A red carpet, thicker and plusher than the one at the Oscars, stretched up the iconic stairs, flanked by velvet ropes and photographers whose flashbulbs popped like distant lightning. Vian stepped out of his Uber Black. He couldn't secure a limo on such short notice, and adjusted his tuxedo. It was the same tux he wore to his wedding, though he'd never admit that to anyone. He felt small. Usually, Vian Brown walked into a room and owned it. But here he was, a minnow in a tank of megalodons. He scanned the crowd. He saw a senator from New York laughing with a tech giant from Silicon Valley. He saw an oil baroness clinking glasses with a royal duke. This was old money, the kind of money that didn't yell. It whispered, and empires crumbled. Vian, over here. Ethan Caldwell was standing near a massive Egyptian statue, holding a glass of amber liquid. Ethan looked effortless. While Vian was sweating through his starch, Ethan looked like he was born in a tuxedo. Ethan, Vian said, rushing over, extending a hand. Thank you for getting me in. We need to talk numbers. Ethan didn't shake his hand. He just smiled, a cruel curl of the lip. Relax, Brown. Drink first. Business later. Besides, you haven't seen the main event yet. I don't care about the event, Vian hissed, leaning in. I need $20 million by tomorrow morning. I'll give you 15% equity in Brown Tech. Ethan laughed loud enough that heads turned. 15% Vian by tomorrow morning. Your company won't be worth the paper the stock certificates are printed on. I hear Apex Ventures is foreclosing. Vian froze. How do you know that? Everyone knows. Ethan swirled his drink. Bad news travels fast in this room. You're radioactive, my friend. But I might be persuaded to buy your debt for 60% equity and full board control. 60%. That's robbery, Vian choked. That's mercy, Ethan countered. Take it or leave it. But hush now. The hosts are arriving. The lights in the great hall dimmed. A hush fell over the hundreds of guests. A spotlight hit the top of the grand staircase. Ladies and gentlemen, a voice boomed over the speakers. Please welcome the chairman of the Sinclair Group, Mr. Arthur Sinclair, and his daughter, the director of the foundation, Ms. Lydia Sinclair. Vian rolled his eyes. Sinclair again. Who cares about? His voice died in his throat. At the top of the stairs stood an older man, with silver hair and a jawline like granite, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than Vian's house. But Vian didn't look at him. He looked at the woman on his arm. It was Lydia. But it wasn't his Lydia. It wasn't the woman in the sensible sweaters and the messy bun. This woman was a vision. She wore a gown of shimmering emerald silk that hugged every curve, dripping with diamonds that caught the spotlight and threw rainbows across the room. Her hair was a cascading wave of gold, her posture, regal, her face, painted with a confidence that Vian had never seen. She didn't look down at her feet. She looked out at the crowd like she owned them. That's Lydia, Vian whispered, his brain misfiring. That's my wife. Ethan Caldwell leaned in his breath, smelling of expensive scotch. Correction, Vian. That's your ex-wife. And that is Lydia Sinclair, the sole heir to the Sinclair banking fortune. Did you really not know? Vian felt the room spin. The Sinclair from the bank documents. The Sinclair from the shipping company that just cancelled his contract. Lydia. She said her dad was a mechanic. Vian stammered, his legs feeling like jelly. He likes to restore vintage Ferraris. Ethan chuckled. It's a hobby. He spends his weekends in Greece, but during the week he moves nations. Vian watched as Lydia descended the stairs. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. Billionaires bowed their heads. Celebrities reached out just to touch her hand. She moved with a grace that was terrifying. She reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped scanning the room. Her eyes locked onto Vian's. For a second, the room disappeared. It was just the two of them. Vian expected her to look away, to be embarrassed, or perhaps sad. Instead, she smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator recognizing wounded prey. She whispered something to her father, and Arthur Sinclair's gaze snapped to Vian. The older man's eyes were cold enough to freeze hell. Oh, God, Vian whispered. Go say hello. Ethan pushed him forward. It's rude to ignore family. Vian stumbled forward, propelled by a mix of shock and a desperate, frantic need to salvage the situation. His brain was running a mile a minute, rewriting history. She's rich. She's powerful. I can fix this. We're not technically divorced yet. The papers. Did the judge sign them? He pushed through a group of Japanese investors, ignoring their annoyed glares, and planted himself right in Lydia's path. Lydia. He called out, his voice cracking slightly. The music seemed to stop. The circle of elites surrounding her fell silent, sensing blood in the water. Lydia turned slowly. Up close, she was breathtaking and intimidating. The necklace she wore, a cascade of sapphires, was likely worth more than the Series B funding he was begging for. Vian, she said. Her voice was cool, smooth, stripped of the warmth she used to reserve for him. I didn't expect to see you here. This is a charity event. Usually you only attend things that benefit you. Lydia, what is this? Vian gestured wildly at her dress, the room her father. You. Why didn't you tell me? Tell you what? She asked innocently. That my family has money. Would it have mattered? Vian. Would you have loved me more? Vian faltered. We're partners, Lydia. Secrets. Secrets destroy marriages. No, Vian. Contempt destroys marriages, she corrected him. And you had plenty of that. You told me I wasn't CEO material. You told me I didn't understand power. She took a step closer, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She towered over him, not in height, but in presence. Do I look like CEO material now? Lydia, please. Vian lowered his voice, trying to deploy his famous charm. He reached for her hand, but a large, heavy hand clamped onto his shoulder, stopping him dead. It was Arthur Sinclair. The grip was like iron. This wasn't the grip of a soft banker. It was the grip of a man who worked with his hands. I believe the lady has finished speaking with you, Arthur rumbled. His voice was deep, gravelly, and terrifying. Vian looked at the man he had mocked just days ago. Arthur, Mr. Sinclair, there's been a misunderstanding. I have the utmost respect for your daughter. Respect? Arthur laughed, a short, sharp sound. I saw the divorce papers, son. I saw the stipend you offered her. $2,000 a month. My daughter spends that on flower arrangements. I didn't know, Vian pleaded. She told me you were a mechanic. I am, Arthur said, a dangerous glint in his eye. I fix things that are broken, and I scrap things that are useless. Right now, Vian, you're looking a lot like scrap metal. Vian pulled away from the grip, straightening his jacket, trying to regain some dignity. Look, this is personal, but business is business. Mr. Sinclair, your company Apex Ventures is holding my debt. If you call it in, you destroy a promising company. You destroy value. It's bad business. Lydia laughed. It was a genuine, amused laugh that cut Vian deeper than any insult. Oh, Vian. She shook her head. You still don't get it. Apex Ventures wasn't an investment fund. It was a piggy bank. My piggy bank. Vian blinked. What? I authorized every loan. Lydia revealed her eyes, dancing with triumph. When no bank in the city would touch your spaghetti code, I told Daddy to fund you. When you needed payroll, I wrote the check. Apex isn't calling in the debt because of market volatility. I'm calling in the debt because I'm done paying for your ego. The realization hit Vian like a physical blow. The genius of Brown tech, the financial wizardry. It was all her. It had always been her. He hadn't been a self-made man. He had been a kept man. You can't do this, Vian whispered, his face pale. The prenup. The prenup you wrote, Lydia smirked. The one that says separate assets. It works both ways, darling. My billions are mine. Your debt, that's all yours. She leaned in close, her lips brushing his ear, so only he could hear the final nail in the coffin. And by the way, I saw Jessica earlier. She was asking Ethan Caldwell for a job. She told him her current boss was dead weight. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Lydia pulled back, dismissed him with a wave of her hand, and turned to her father. Come on, Daddy. The governor is waiting for us. Arthur gave Vian one last look, a look of pure pity, and turned away. Vian stood alone in the middle of the crowded hall. The photographers, realizing something dramatic had just happened, turned their lenses toward him. Flashbulbs erupted in his face, blinding him. He felt stripped naked, exposed. He looked around for an ally. He saw Ethan Caldwell raising a glass to him from across the room, mouthing the words, 60%. Vian realized with a sinking heart that 60% was now a fantasy. He wouldn't even have that. He was going to lose everything. And the woman who could have saved him, the woman he had discarded like trash, was the one holding the match. The fall of Vian Brown didn't happen with a whimper. It happened with the deafening roar of a landslide, burying him under the weight of his own hubris. The morning after the gala, the sun rose over Manhattan with a cruel, cheerful brightness. Vian woke up in his suite at the Four Seasons, a pounding headache, reminding him of the excessive scotch he had consumed after Arthur Sinclair had publicly eviscerated him. But as he splashed cold water on his face, looking at his bloodshot eyes in the marble vanity mirror, the denial began to set in. He was Vian Brown. He was a visionary. He had talked his way out of bankruptcy before. He would do it again. The Sinclairs were just trying to scare him. It was a negotiation tactic. That's all it was. Shower. Suit. Coffee. War room. He muttered to himself, executing his morning routine with robotic precision. He put on his favorite charcoal grey suit, the one he wore for his Fortune magazine cover shoot, and tied his tie with a perfect Windsor knot. He needed to look invincible. He didn't check his phone. He didn't want to see the notifications. He just needed to get to the office and rally the troops. But the war was already over. When the Uber pulled up to the glass and steel tower that housed Brown Tech, Vian noticed something odd. There was a lack of movement. Usually at 8:30 a.m., the lobby was a hive of activity interns juggling coffee trays, developers rushing to stand-up meetings. Today it was still. Vian strode to the turnstiles, flashing his signature smile at the security guard, a man named Miller, whom Vian had walked past for 3 years without ever learning his first name. "Morning, Miller," Vian said, tapping his access card against the reader. Beep. A harsh red light flashed. Vian frowned. He tapped it again. Beep. Must be a glitch, Vian muttered, annoyed. "Miller, buzz me in, would you? I have a board meeting in 10 minutes. Miller didn't move. He stood behind the console, his arms crossed his face, an unreadable mask of stone. "I can't do that, Mr. Brown." "Excuse me," Vian scoffed, leaning over the desk. "I'm the CEO of this company. Open the gate." "You were the CEO," a voice boomed from the direction of the elevators. Vian spun around. Standing there wasn't his assistant or his VP. It was a man in a windbreaker, with huge yellow letters on the back, U.S. Marshal. Beside him stood 2 uniformed officers, and a woman in a severe black suit, holding a stack of files. "Vian Brown?" the Marshal asked, stepping forward. "Yes, but I don't understand. This building is now a seized asset under the jurisdiction of the Federal Bankruptcy Court." The Marshal stated, his voice echoing in the silent lobby. "We are executing a foreclosure order on behalf of the primary creditor, Apex Ventures." "Foreclosure?" Vian laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. "That's impossible. We have a 30-day grace period. I know the law." The woman in the black suit stepped forward. "Actually, Mr. Brown, you signed a waiver of that grace period in the Series A bridge loan agreement 3 years ago. Clause 14. Section B. In the event of a material breach of trust or leadership instability, the creditor reserves the right to immediate asset forfeiture." "Material breach of trust," Vian spat. "I haven't breached anything. The board voted at 6:00 a.m., the woman said calmly. "They removed you for gross negligence. You're trespassing, Mr. Brown. You need to leave the premises immediately." Vian looked around. A small crowd of his employees had gathered on the mezzanine level looking down. He expected to see outrage. He expected them to rush down and defend their leader. Instead, he saw relief. He saw whispers. He saw a developer he had screamed at last week, taking a photo with his phone. They weren't mourning him. They were watching the show. "I need to get my things," Vian stammered, his bravado crumbling. "My laptop, my files, the photo of my mother on my desk. Personal effects will be boxed and mailed to your last known address," the Marshal said, placing a hand on his holster. "Please, sir, don't make us escort you out." Vian backed away, his hands trembling. He turned and stumbled through the revolving doors, the heat of the city hitting him like a physical blow. He needed Jessica. Jessica was the fixer. Jessica knew where the backup accounts were. Jessica would know how to spin this. He pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling over the screen. He dialed her number. The number you have reached is no longer in service. He froze. He tried the office line. Dead. He opened his email app to send her an urgent message. Login failed. Account disabled. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced his chest. He looked up and saw a moving truck parked at the side entrance. It wasn't loading equipment out. It was loading files in. And standing by the loading dock directing the movers was Jessica. She looked different. The nervous energy she usually carried around him was gone. She stood tall, holding a tablet, checking off inventory with a ruthlessness he recognized because he had taught it to her. "Jessica!" Vian screamed, sprinting down the sidewalk, ignoring the traffic signals. Horns blared as he dodged a taxi. "Jessica!" She turned. She saw him running towards her, disheveled and frantic. She didn't flinch. She simply held up a hand to signal the movers to pause. "Vian," she said. Her tone was conversational, as if they were discussing lunch orders. "Jessica, what is going on?" Vian grabbed her arm. "They locked me out. The marshals are there. We need to activate the Cayman accounts. We need to—" She gently but firmly removed his hand from her arm. "There are no Cayman accounts, Vian. Lydia liquidated them an hour ago. She owned the shell companies, remember?" But you—" Vian gasped for air. "We need to fix this. You and me. We can start over. I have the IP in my head." Jessica looked at him with a gaze so pitying it burned. "Viana, I just signed a contract with Caldwell Holdings. Ethan hired me as his new VP of Operations. My first task is to oversee the acquisition of Brown Tech's assets for pennies on the dollar." Vian reeled back. You went to Ethan. You traitor, after everything I did for you. What did you do for me?" "Vian." Jessica stepped closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. "You took credit for my strategies. You made me lie to investors. You made me create a fake persona to trick your wife. And yesterday, when the ship started sinking, you didn't try to save the crew. You ran to the gala to save yourself. I did it for us. There was never an us," she said coldly. "There was just you and the people you used. I'm done being used. Oh, and Vian." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small white envelope. "This was left for you at the front desk. I figured I'd save the postage." She shoved the envelope into his chest. "Goodbye, Vian. Try not to make a scene. It's bad for the brand." She turned her back on him and walked into the building, his building leaving him standing in the exhaust fumes of the truck. Vian tore open the envelope. It was a letter from his bank. Notice of insufficient funds. He checked his banking app. He stared at the screen, unable to comprehend the numbers. Checking minus $4,200. Overdraft savings, $0. Investment portfolio frozen by court order. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." He was thirsty. His throat felt like sandpaper. He walked into a nearby Starbucks, dazed. He ordered a black coffee, his hand shaking as he tapped his platinum credit card against the reader. Declined. "Try it again," he snapped at the barista. "I tried it twice, sir. It says, card reported lost or stolen." "It's not stolen. I'm standing right here," Vian yelled, slamming his hand on the counter. The shop went quiet. People stared. The great Vian Brown fighting with a teenager over a $3 coffee. He left the coffee on the counter and ran out. He had to get home. He had cash in the safe at the mansion. He had watches he could sell. He had the Audi. He took the subway, the humiliation burning his skin back to the Palisades. It took 2 hours. By the time he walked up the long, winding driveway to his estate, the sky had turned a bruised purple. Thunder rumbled in the distance. He reached the front gate. It was closed. He punched in the code 1985. Error. He punched it again. Error. What is happening? He screamed at the keypad. A black sedan was parked in the driveway. A man in a beige trench coat stepped out. It was his landlord, Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson. Vian ran to the gate, gripping the iron bars. The gate is broken. Let me in. Mr. Henderson didn't open the gate. He stood on the other side, looking uncomfortable. I'm afraid I can't do that, Vian. I saw the news. The bankruptcy. The fraud allegations. It's a misunderstanding. I just need to get inside. The lease has a morality clause. Vian. And an insolvency clause. Henderson said, holding up a set of keys. I've changed the locks. Your possessions have been removed. Vian looked past him. On the manicured lawn, sitting in the rain that had just begun to fall, were garbage bags. Black plastic garbage bags. My things, Vian whispered. We packed the clothes. The furniture stays. It was a furnished rental, remember? Henderson sighed. I'm sorry, son, but I can't have the feds seizing my property because of your debts. You need to go. Where am I supposed to go? Vian's voice broke. I have nowhere. That's not my problem, Henderson said, turning around and walking back to the house. The rain began to pour. It soaked through Vian's charcoal suit. It plastered his hair to his skull. He climbed over the fence, tearing his trousers, and ran to the bags. He ripped one open. Inside were his Italian loafers thrown in with his dirty gym socks. He fell to his knees in the mud. The grandeur of his life, the penthouse, the company, the reputation had been reduced to 4 garbage bags on a wet lawn in New Jersey. He had one option left. One Hail Mary. He dug his phone out of his pocket. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. He scrolled to the contact he had deleted 2 days ago, then restored in a moment of weakness. Lydia. She would help him. She had to. She was the one who darned his socks. She was the one who made him soup when he had the flu. Beneath the diamonds and the Sinclair name, she was still Lydia. She had a heart. He just needed to remind her. He dialed. Ring. Ring. His heart hammered against his ribs. Ring. Hello. The voice was crisp male and terrifyingly professional. Vian froze. Lydia is Lydia there? This is Charles Harrington, Senior Counsel for Ms. Lydia Sinclair, the voice replied. To whom am I speaking? This is her husband, Vian shouted over the sound of the rain. Put her on the phone. I need to talk to my wife. Mr. Brown. The lawyer's voice was dry like old parchment. Ms. Sinclair is unavailable. She is currently en route to Paris for the G7 summit. She gave strict instructions that any communication from you be directed to my office. I don't want a lawyer. I want Lydia. Tell her I'm sorry. Vian was sobbing now, the tears mixing with the rain. Tell her I made a mistake. Tell her I love her. I have nothing. Do you hear me? I'm on the street. She can't do this to me. Mr. Brown. Harrington interrupted his tone, devoid of any sympathy. Ms. Sinclair anticipated this call. She asked me to relay a message, should you reach out. Vian gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. What is it does she want to meet? She asked me to remind you of the conversation you had at Le Bernardin, Harrington said slowly. You explicitly stated that you needed a partner who understood power. Vian closed his eyes, the memory of his own arrogance flashing before him like a nightmare. Yes, Vian whispered. Ms. Sinclair hopes that you are finally learning what true power feels like. It is not a title, Mr. Brown. It is the ability to shape reality. She has shaped hers, and now she has shaped yours. Please, Vian begged. Do not call this number again. The divorce decree will be finalized on Monday. The terms of the prenuptial agreement regarding the separation of assets, the agreement you insisted upon, will be strictly enforced. Good day, Mr. Brown. Click. The line went dead. Vian stared at the phone. The screen flickered and then went black as the battery died. He sat alone in the mud, surrounded by his trash bags. The massive iron gates of the mansion loomed over him, locking him out of the paradise he thought he deserved. He curled into a ball, shivering violently as the weight of the billion-dollar empire he had thrown away crushed him into the earth. He was finally free, just like he asked, and it cost him everything. 12 months later, the air conditioner in the back of Quick Fix Electronics rattled like a dying engine, dripping condensation onto the linoleum floor. The shop, tucked away in a strip mall in Queens, between a laundromat and a discount dollar store, smelled of burnt solder and stale coffee. Vian Brown sat on a stool that wobbled every time he shifted his weight. He adjusted the magnifying lamp over the workbench, his eyes squinting at the cracked motherboard of a third-generation tablet. "Come on," he whispered, his hand steady, but his spirit broken. Just bridge the connection. His hands, the same hands that used to sign million-dollar contracts at the Ritz-Carlton, were now dry-cracked and stained with flux. He wasn't wearing a bespoke Tom Ford suit anymore. He was wearing a polyester blue polo shirt that was a size too big, with a name tag pinned crookedly to the chest, Vian, Service Tech. The bell above the door chimed a harsh electronic ding that made Vian flinch. "Hey, anyone working here?" a voice shouted from the front. Vian sighed, putting down his soldering iron. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked to the front counter. Standing there was a young man in his mid-20s. He was wearing a fitted navy suit, a shiny watch that looked expensive, but was probably a knockoff, and he was tapping his foot impatiently. He was holding a laptop like it was a piece of trash he wanted to be rid of. "Welcome to Quick Fix," Vian said, his voice flat. "How can I help you?" "I need this screen replaced. Yesterday." The young man snapped, tossing the laptop onto the glass counter. "And don't give me the 3 to 5 business days crap. I have a pitch meeting with investors in 2 hours. I need it done now." Vian looked at the kid. He saw the arrogance in the set of his jaw. He saw the way he looked past Vian, as if the person behind the counter was just a piece of furniture. It was like looking in a time mirror. This was Vian 5 years ago. "I can do an expedited service," Vian said quietly, "but there's a $50 rush fee." $50, the kid scoffed. "Do you know who I am? I'm the founder of Streamline. We're disrupting the logistics sector. I shouldn't be paying rush fees to a strip mall repair shop." Vian felt a flicker of the old anger, the old ego trying to ignite. He wanted to tell this kid that he had lost more money in a single afternoon than Streamline would ever make. He wanted to scream that he used to own the building this kid probably rented an office in. But he didn't. He couldn't afford to get fired. His rent for the basement studio apartment was due on Friday. "It's store policy, sir," Vian said, lowering his head. $50. The kid rolled his eyes and slapped a credit card on the counter. "Fine, just hurry up, and get me a coffee while you're at it. Black." "We don't sell coffee, sir." "Ugh, useless." The kid turned away, pulling out his phone to scream at someone on a call. Vian took the laptop to the back. As he worked, replacing the screen with practiced mechanical movements, his eyes drifted to the small, dust-covered television mounted in the corner of the workshop. It was usually tuned to sports, but today the shop owner had left it on the global news network. The breaking news banner flashed in urgent red live from Geneva UN Global Summit. And now, the news anchor's voice cut through the static. We go live to the keynote address from the year's most influential business figure. She has single-handedly restructured the global banking approach to sustainable energy. Please welcome the CEO of the Sinclair Group, Lydia Sinclair. Vian froze. The screwdriver slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the desk. He walked toward the TV like a moth to a flame. There she was. Lydia. She looked magnificent. She was standing at a podium emblazoned with the United Nations crest. She wore a white suit that radiated power, cut sharp and clean. Her hair, which she used to wear in a messy bun while she gardened, was now styled in elegant waves. But it was her eyes that stopped Vian's heart. They were clear, fierce, and undeniably happy. She wasn't just surviving. She was thriving on a level he had never even comprehended. We cannot build a future on debt and ego. Lydia spoke into the microphone, her voice steady and commanding. True value comes from stability, from patience, from nurturing what is real rather than chasing what is shiny. The camera panned out to show the audience. World leaders, tech billionaires, royalty. They were all leaning forward, listening to her. Listening to the woman Vian had told was not CEO material. She's amazing, isn't she? Vian jumped. He hadn't realized his boss, an older man named Sal, had come up behind him. Yeah, Vian whispered, his throat tight. She is. They say she's going to be the first trillionaire who gives it all away. Sal chewed on his toothpick. And see that guy next to her, the tall one. Vian looked. Standing just behind Lydia, applauding as she finished her speech, was a man. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and a kind, intelligent face. He wasn't wearing a flashy suit. He looked like a professor. That's Dr. Aris Thorne, Sal said. Nobel Prize winner. Physicist. I read in the paper they just got engaged. He looks at her like she hung the moon, doesn't he? Vian watched as Lydia stepped back from the podium. Dr. Thorne reached out, and she took his hand. It wasn't a showy public display of ownership. It was a gentle, reassuring clasp. He whispered something in her ear, and Lydia threw her head back and laughed, a genuine, joyous sound that Vian realized with a sickening jolt he had never made her do. He had bought her jewelry, he had bought her cars, but he had never made her laugh like that. Hey, tech guy, is my laptop done? The shout from the front counter broke the spell. Vian looked back at the TV one last time. Lydia was waving to the crowd, the diamond on her finger, catching the light, not a gaudy rock like the one he had given her to show off his wealth, but something elegant, timeless. Yeah, Vian muttered. It's done. He walked back to the front and slid the laptop across the counter. The young entrepreneur grabbed it, checked the screen, and grunted. About time. He pulled 2 crumpled dollar bills from his pocket and tossed them at Vian. Here, for your trouble. Buy yourself a clue. The kid stormed out, the bell chiming cheerfully behind him. Vian stood alone in the silence of the shop. He looked down at the $2. It wasn't even enough for a subway fare. He looked at his reflection in the glass counter. The lines around his eyes were deeper. His hair was thinning. He looked tired. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had held the world in his hands and dropped it because he wanted to see if it would bounce. It didn't bounce. It shattered. He picked up the $2 and put them in the tip jar. Then he picked up his rag and started wiping the counter, scrubbing away the fingerprints of the man he used to be. On the TV, the applause for Lydia Sinclair was still going. It sounded like rain. Happy anniversary, Lydia, Vian whispered to the empty room. Damn. That hits hard, doesn't it? Vian Brown spent his whole life climbing the ladder only to realize he had placed it against the wrong wall. He threw away a diamond because he was too busy looking for glitter. He wanted a wife who understood power, and ironically, he got exactly what he asked for. She used her power to show him his place. This story isn't just about money or divorce, it's about value. It's about recognizing the people in your life who support you before they're gone. Vian learned the hard way that the grass isn't greener on the other side. It's greener where you water it. And he let his garden die. What do you think? Did Vian deserve that level of punishment? Or was Lydia too harsh? I want to hear your take. Drop a comment below. I read the first 500 comments. If you enjoyed this roller coaster of karma and revenge, please smash that like button, share this video with a friend who loves drama, and hit subscribe with the notification bell on. I've got an even crazier story coming next week about a cheating husband and a winning lottery ticket that you do not want to miss. Thanks for watching, and remember, treat people right, or you might just end up fixing their laptops.